Good morning. My name is Christine Guerrero, and I'm one of the League's Regional Public Affairs Managers for the Los Angeles County Division. Welcome to today's webinar on advancing racial equity and introduction. This webinar is part of a growing collection of resources that the League is providing to help city leaders expand their knowledge and capacity to eliminate racial disparities, heal racial divisions, and build more equitable communities. Our speaker today is Leon Andrews, Director of the National League of Cities Race, Equity, and Leadership, or REAL. I'd also like to recognize League Executive Director Carolyn Coleman and our President John Dunbar, Mayor of the town of Yountville. Thank you again for joining us today, and now it's my pleasure to introduce our Executive Director, Carolyn Coleman.
Thank you, Christine, and welcome to all who have joined today's important webinar. This is a very timely discussion for us to be having. Before we hear from our main speaker today, it is my pleasure to invite President Dunbar for a few remarks.
Carolyn, thank you very much. It's a real privilege and honor to have Leon with us today for this webinar. I thank all of you for participating. As Carolyn said, very important, very timely message that we are sharing today. Over the past few months, the painful realities of systemic racism in our institutions and in our communities has come to the forefront with resounding calls for equity and justice. And as elected officials, it is our duty not only to hear those calls, but to respond with meaningful action. We have a tremendous opportunity and responsibility to evaluate, reimagine, and reform our institutions to ensure our systems are equitable and just. In June, the League's Board of Directors adopted a statement affirming that the League opposes any expression of discrimination or racism toward any person, and we are committed to rooting out systemic racial bias wherever and whenever it exists. The statement committed to analyzing institutions to ensure their systems are just, listening to voices of those who have suffered bias and prejudice, strengthening community engagement and fostering strong local partnerships that are inclusive, transparent, and build trust, and reevaluating city services and programs through an equity lens. Racial bias has been ingrained in our institutions for decades. It's time instead to embed equity and justice into the fabric of those same institutions. As local government leaders, it is our responsibility to drive the change and accountability that we need to see throughout our society. Reform will not happen overnight, but as city leaders, we must ensure that our democracy and civil liberties are strengthened to create a more equitable and just society for future generations. We can and should build on what leaders before us have accomplished, continuing the work that achieves impactful and sustainable progress toward liberty and justice for all. I want you to know the League is here to support you as you do this valuable work in each of your communities. Today's webinar is just one example of the education and capacity building the League will continue to provide all of our local leaders. I want to thank each of you for your contributions that you're making in your cities, in your communities, but also with the League of California Cities. Again, thank you very much for participating today. Carolyn, I'll hand it back to you.
Mayor, thank you, and thank you for your leadership of the League this year. Very inspiring. Before we continue, I'm going to cover just a few housekeeping items. First, this webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to attendees following today's event. Now, as you may have noticed, we have muted the phone lines of all participants. However, we will have an opportunity for a question and answer session following Leon's presentation. To write in a question, you will just select the Q&A button on your toolbar. I know you all have participated in many Zoom calls over the last several months, so this is second nature to you. You can also upvote other attendees' questions if you have the same one. This will help us prioritize the questions during the Q&A portion of the program. And now it is my pleasure to introduce my friend and our speaker, Leon Andrews. But first, let me tell you a little bit about Leon Andrews. He is NLC's, the National League of Cities, first director of Race, Equity, and Leadership, or REAL. It's an initiative to promote equity and encourage honest conversations about race in our communities. But over the years, he has been a very vocal advocate for policies that encourage diversity, inclusion, and economic and racial justice. A native of the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., Leon joined the National League of Cities in 2006, spending 8 years as a senior fellow and program director of NLC's Institute for Youth Education and Families, where he worked with municipal officials to address problems affecting young people and promote youth engagement and leadership. Before joining NLC, Leon was a research fellow at the Forum for Youth Investment. Previous roles include work for the U.S. Department of Justice, the office of former U.S. Senator Barbara Mikulski, the United States Public Interest Research Group, the Allegheny County Department of Human Services, Youth Build Pittsburgh, the Development Corporation of Columbia Heights, and PricewaterhouseCoopers. He has also been an adjunct political science professor at Eastern Michigan University. Leon serves on the boards of Change Lab Solutions, the National Recreation and Park Association, the National Council on Crime and Delinquency, and the National Network for Youth. With a master's degree in public policy and management, Leon is now a PhD candidate in the University of Michigan's Urban and Regional Planning program. He lives in Washington, D.C. with his amazing wife, Dr. Christine Andrews, and their 3 beautiful daughters. Leon, over to you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's so great to be with you today, this afternoon. Obviously, in the context of where we stand, there's so much going on in our world, from the pandemic, the coronavirus, to the racial tension, to our economic challenges that we're seeing across the city. And what I'd like to do is really bring some of that into the room as we are talking about why racial equity and why it is so important for the work within cities. So I'm going to start off with this short video that really brings some of the moments into the room.
Please, I can appreciate.
Why is a black life any more recoupable than a white life?
Let it be known wherever we go that all of us should be free and equal and have all opportunities that others should have.
I am the people. I'm not the pig. You got to make a distinction. And the people are going to have to attack the pigs. The people are going to have to stand up against the pigs.
So the only way we're going to get some of this oppression and exploitation away from us or aside from us is come together against the common enemy.
I'm tired of my black men and my black women being shot, being killed by the NYPD.
For hundreds of years, black people and people of colour be absolutely abused and killed on the streets, and it's just getting worse and worse. We've had enough, and if they're not going to listen, we're going to scream louder and louder, and we're not going to stop until something is done. We've had enough. This is people who have had enough. It's time to make some change.
I thought that video in 3 minutes really captures the the moment that so many of us are seeing in our cities across California, across this country, cities of all sizes, towns and villages, that the tension that's there, the people communicating enough is enough. We're tired, right? And they're finding ways of expressing themselves in this moment in our towns and in our cities across the country. And I really appreciate your president, Mayor Dunbar, your leadership and the commitment by the State League, League of California Cities, to really create this space for the conversation. Really, what does this look like for you as city leaders as you are facing this tension? What does it mean to lead in this space? And I wanted to acknowledge this quote that I wanted to bring into the room from the late Dr. Maya Angelou. I thought does a really good job of naming the moment, right? Her quote, "Prejudice is a burden that confuses the past. It threatens the future and renders the present inaccessible," really speaks to the moment of our ability to really talk about what does leadership look like, where we are acknowledging the need to be explicit about the challenges that are facing those in our communities, trying to figure out how we are making sure that as we're facing it, that we're doing everything we can to be intentional about our leadership in this space, where we're not looking to come back to this another year from now, 5 years from now, 50 years from now, but really committed to going beyond just preventing further conflict, right? We recognize as leaders that there's an opportunity for us as city leaders to really step into this space. And that really is what I'm excited about as I try to find my way back to the hopeful space, as we're seeing the tension and recognizing that this is an opportunity. And REAL was created with that backdrop 5 years ago. When REAL was created, it was at that time the backdrop of Ferguson, the killing of Michael Brown. And Ferguson is a member of the National League of Cities. So they reached out to us at the time and were looking for help. We at the time didn't have a lot of work or doing any specific work on racial justice. And so we were struggling to be an asset and a resource for the city leaders as they were dealing with the tension. We obviously said, don't do what you're doing, those tanks on the streets, that's not going to help. But we recognized that from that moment, we realized that cities, Ferguson was not the only city that would be facing this tension. From Baltimore to McKinney, Texas, to North Charleston, city after city, were asking, 5 years ago, help us at that point not become a Ferguson, right? And that was a very different kind of conversation of city leaders really trying to prevent conflict. So how do I prevent further conflict? And what we're hearing is very different in these last 3 months from city leaders. It's not about preventing conflict. It's about how do I lead? What's my role in this? What's the opportunity for us to really step in and to acknowledge the work that we need to do in local government to really respond to the tension? And REAL was created with that focus, with that goal and our mission in mind, to strengthen local leaders, your knowledge, your capacity to understand what roles you play in eliminating racial disparities, healing those racial tensions in your communities, and building more equitable communities. And so our work, we do a number of things with cities, from trainings and capacity building to technical assistance work, to also networking. Something very powerful, even as city leaders are dealing with the tension of connecting with your peers, those that have gone through it and those that are in the midst of it. And so there's a lot of networking and connecting you that I think is so important in helping you navigate through these opportunities, as well as recognizing the opportunity that is there through connecting it to so much of the special populations work. We have found that doing our boys and men of color work, you have to center racial equity in the space. As we are understanding LGBTQ issues, how are we centering racial equity, or our religiously persecuted, or our indigenous community, or our women and girls, really recognizing the intersections of this work. And you'll hear that as really a really important piece of understanding racial equity in the work we do. And so our network in the last 5 years, we have now engaged in over 400 cities, towns, and villages across this country. As you can see, over 700 city leaders. That number has increased exponentially since this map was created in the last 3 months, with the amount of over 1,000 cities that have been facing protests and uprisings in their cities. But what I really want to convey as we start this dialogue and continue the work that we do in partnership with the League of California Cities is that there's no one city here that has figured it out. While it's great to see all of these dots that are on the map, and great to see that there are city leaders who are wanting to lead in this space, or some that have been doing it for a very long time, no one would tell you that they have solved or eradicated racism in their city. They're on this journey, and this is the opportunity many of them see to really build on the foundation, the movement, the commitment that's out there to really talk about what does change actually look like, and want to name that as we are on this journey, because it's not as if we can say we'll follow Seattle and figure it out, do it the way Seattle did it, or Boston, or Madison, Wisconsin. And so it's important to have a framework as we do this work and how we think about supporting cities. And there are some really good frameworks that we've been able to partner to help build as we've been providing technical assistance, as REAL has been building its tools. And so I wanted to acknowledge one of our partners, formal partnerships that we had over 4 years ago when we were launching REAL with the Center for Social Inclusion, who is now partnered with who is now merged with Race Forward, and the Government Alliance for Race and Equity. So that has been an important partnership. What they have been able to do for us in the space of not reinventing the wheel is to help us take a framework that we think could be very helpful for cities and city leaders, and really build out our curriculum and to build out our training, build out our tools. And I want to spend some time really walking you through components of this framework. You'll hear us kind of talk about strategies and the work we do with cities in these 3 areas. The first, we'll spend most of our time together, is in the normalizing space. Like, what's the work that you need to do as city leaders to normalize this work within your city, and normalizing it with your colleagues on council, to normalize it with your staff, to normalize it with the community? What's the work that needs to happen around normalizing? That's going to be so super critical, realizing everyone has different starting points in how they're understanding this issue, and in particular thinking about what it means to, as a local government, to lead. And so the normalizing space is a really important component to the work we do. But then after normalizing, then the work around how do you start operationalizing? What are some tools you need to use, or understanding data, and how do you use that lens as you're making decisions? And then how do you get organized? What's the work that needs to happen with the infrastructures and the partnerships, and how does that work within your community? And so we're going to take some time in each of these areas. I want to start initially with the normalizing, really initially talking about why we lead with race, the urgency of understanding the importance of leading with race and prioritizing that in how we have been able to build out the work we do with cities. And I just want to acknowledge, when you heard in the introduction from Carolyn and also from your president, REAL, when it was created, there was an intentionality of calling out race. There was a comma between race. It was race, comma, equity, and leadership. So we, as an organization, wanted to be committed to talking about race and helping city leaders understand race, but also to understand its intersections with all the range of equity issues that we think cities are dealing with. And so when we had that first REAL talk 5 years ago, it was about 400 city leaders in the room, and it was a conversation that, to be honest, it was a mess. We were talking about everything and nothing all at the same time. And we realized very early on that if you're going to be committed to doing this work, you have to be very intentional about how you're framing it and walking into creating spaces for people to understand the intentionality of the conversation. And so one of the things we did very early on was to really surround myself in particular, as I was leading this, with folks that were out there doing the work, national experts and advisors that really helped me understand very clearly why, what the data was saying to us, why it was important to learn from other people's strategies. And one of the aspects that really stood out for us very early on was the data. And the data continues to be such an important part of this work. Because as we look at the data, whether we're talking about infant mortality to life expectancy, race is still the strongest predictor of one's success in this country. And so whether we're talking about our education or our criminal justice or health or housing, race still continues to be the strongest predictor of one's success in this country. And I wanted to name that by acknowledging a couple of things. One was this study that was done by the Center for Disease Control. It was done a few years ago, looking at maternal mortality rates and controlling for everything in a woman's background. Controlled how much money she made, her income. It controlled for her educational status. It controlled for where she lived in the region across the country. And as they controlled for everything else, they still found that Black women had 2 to 3 times higher rates of maternal mortality. Controlling for everything else, still race being the strongest predictor at looking at maternal mortality, right? And that was looking at the study 3 years ago around maternal mortality, but we could be talking about a number of other issues. We could be talking about our criminal justice system. We could be talking about our educational system. We could be talking about our workforce and unemployment. We could be talking about housing. And what has been what has happened for so many cities and for this country in the last for several months, 5 months, as we've been faced with the coronavirus, the light has been shown on these disparities. We all have seen or now are hearing about the disproportionate number of Black, Latinx communities and indigenous populations that are being impacted by the coronavirus, that are contracting the virus and that are dying from this virus. And also the disproportionate number of folks within the Black community, Latinx community, and the indigenous community that are impacted by the unemployment rates, right? We're seeing what coronavirus is shining a spotlight on what we knew existed before coronavirus, right? And so now we're coupling that with the racial tension that's happening, is just shining a bigger spotlight on what we've already known, right? As we've been talking about racial equity in this work, but it's helping folks sit with this and understand, particularly city leaders, as we think about what does it mean then to talk about racial equity, right? And that's one space we want to be able to normalize with you, because you've been hearing the term racial equity. What is racial equity? If we know that the data is showing that whether we're talking about infant mortality or life expectancy or unemployment, if we know that race is still continuing to show it's still the strongest predictor of one's success in this country, racial equity is closing the gaps where race is no longer predicting one's success while improving outcomes for all, right? And so that's the work of racial equity. We don't want to see race be the strongest predictor of one's success in this country. We want to see that we're closing the gaps where that's not happening, while we also see outcomes improve for everyone. And so then racial equity, if that's our goal, is to then what's the work then we need to do to be targeted in our strategies? How do we a term that Dr. John Powell used, who's at California, Berkeley, he leads the Othering and Belonging Institute there, called targeted universalism. How do we be targeted in our process, but universal in our goals? And to be able to do that, how do we then do the work that really helps us go beyond looking for services or programs, but focused on getting to the root causes of the why? Why is it, as we look at the maternal mortality rates, that Black women still have 2 to 3 times higher rates of death, right? Why is that? Getting to the root causes of the why. And that for me was a very enlightening part of the work very early on for us, as I thought about a lot of the work that I was leading prior to taking on this work around racial equity. One of the portfolios work that I was leading was around our childhood obesity, our healthy communities work, and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation was very much invested in reversing childhood obesity rates. So they were investing over $500 million to a number of different organizations and efforts to really see childhood obesity rates go down. By 2016 was their goal at the time. And so the National League of Cities was involved in working with a lot of local governments, worked with a number of cities in California, and partnered with the League of California Cities as well to really help, shift this mindset where, when we were, very early on doing this work, a lot of the city leaders saw this as a personal responsibility. This was now, I know, almost 15 years ago, and we've seen how much we've changed in this work. But 15 years ago, a lot of the issue was, well, these kids need to stop eating junk food and they need to stop playing video games. And it was a lot of work that was spent into helping city leaders understand the policies that they could change, from complete streets policies to shared use agreements to land use policies. And there was a consistent effort across the country where we're seeing all these policies and that were being changed. And so as we got closer to 2016, there was efforts to start to evaluate where we starting to see childhood obesity rates go down. It was $500 million spent. Maybe childhood obesity rates, we're starting to see some impact by all that investment. And what did they find? For those that were early adolescents, they actually started to see the rates go down. In some of the studies they were doing in Mississippi and the city of Philadelphia, the rates were starting to go down for early adolescents. And for middle adolescents, it was starting to plateau. So we weren't seeing it increase. It was kind of flattening. And then for the late adolescents, it wasn't spiking as much. So they were starting to see progress across the board. And so there was an effort to kind of celebrate that for a moment, like, wow, look at all this great work we've done and all these great policies we put out, and we really are making a difference, right? And it wasn't until after the $500 million was spent that someone asked, well, is it going down for everyone? As a field, we didn't have an answer to that. And so as they started to evaluate if childhood obesity rates were going down for everyone, guess what they found? For Blacks, for the Latinx community, and for the Indigenous community, it was still spiking. So we could have overall rates go down, but it still continues to exacerbate the inequities for the populations that needed it the most. And that for me was like the light bulb moment, like, that's racial equity, right? We need to be targeted, right? If we're going to be committed, we don't want to see that happen in our communities, right? It doesn't benefit us in our communities to see the inequities continue to be exacerbated. So what's the work that we need to do to be targeted in our strategy, but universal in these goals, right? And that was, for me, hopefully helpful to you as you hear that and understand in the space of normalizing racial equity, what racial equity is. And so I wanted to start there while also kind of bringing into the room where we were 5 years ago when we had this real talk. Because while I've just named what racial equity is, there were a lot for us to kind of still process about how do we help city leaders understand the work and what it is to lead in this space. And so we had this real talk at the museum in Washington, D.C. Clarence Anthony, our CEO, was fairly new at the time as our CEO, and our two past presidents now, Councilmember Matt Zone from Cleveland in the middle, and former Mayor Karen Freeman Wilson from Gary, Indiana, was also part of the panel. And Tim Wise to the right was one of our real board members, real board of advisors. So I want to play a short clip from that real talk that really names a lot of the issues that are so important to sit with as we talk about normalizing racial equity.
Tim, you have written a book about this subject from a different perspective. What are your thoughts, opening thoughts about where we are in America right now?
Well, in the 3 minutes, 3 to 5 that we've been given, I'll do my best to answer it. And I know we're going to get deeper into this conversation as we go, so I'll save some of what I want to talk about for that. But I really appreciate the way that you framed the discussion at the outset, because at least on 2 occasions I heard you reference something that we really don't do very much in this country, and that is you referenced systemic racism, and you referred to it in that way. And I think that's important. In fact, it's critical, not just for the National League of Cities effort, but for our conversation as a country, because too often what we do, and I think we all know this, is we look at racism as that thing that happened in Charleston. That is to say, and when I say that thing that happened, I'm not talking about the generations of institutional racism. I'm talking about the thing that happened this summer. We look at that as racism. We say, well, Dylan Roof walks into a church and massacres 9 people, and the city comes together, and the state comes together, and the country grieves, and that's racism. And then we sort of wash our hands of it because we say, well, thankfully, that doesn't happen every week. That doesn't happen all the time. That's an anomaly. But we have to be prepared to look at racism as something that's far deeper than that, and not about bigotry, not about overt hatred, and not just about that type of random retail violence, because that's retail violence. We got wholesale violence. And by that, I mean, if you're going to understand what happened in Baltimore in the last 6 months, you cannot start with Freddie Gray, and you cannot start even with the police department in Baltimore. You have to start with the fact that that is a community that was wrecked by so-called urban renewal. That was violence. When they come in and they put the interstate through your community and they knock down your business and they knock down your apartments and they make folks huddle into small crowded housing and they essentially lock them in a holding pen. I mean, we talk about housing and education. We talk about neighborhoods as if it's not about racism. We act like folks just ended up where they ended up. But let's be clear, this thing that we in this country call the ghetto, that was created. And it wasn't created by black people, and it wasn't created by poor people. It was created by folks who were usually not black and definitely not poor as a holding pen for the people they didn't want to live amongst them. So we have to be prepared to call that violence. If you don't call zoning laws and redlining violence, even though it does violence, and you don't call it racism, then how are we going to solve that? So I want us to frame this conversation the way that you've done it. And I think that's where we are as a country. We're still stuck in this mode of describing racism as this interpersonal thing rather than understanding it structurally and institutionally. And I think until we get to that place where we can talk about not just that individual cop who does something wrong in the community, which we can see plenty of examples of that, but until we deal with the mentality that says that spatial isolation, segregation, residential isolation, black and brown kids going to schools 12 times more likely to be places of concentrated poverty. That's not an accident. People didn't choose that. And so I think that's where we need to go, is to frame the conversation in a way that reminds us that we're talking about systemic and structural violence. And we can't just talk about the sort of retail level stuff, as important as that is, and as horrific as a hate crime is. To be really honest, at the risk of being hyperbolic, aspects of this country's history have been an intergenerational hate crime against certain people. And that's just the truth. We don't like to use language like that. Sounds un-American, unpatriotic, whatever kind of terminology we use, but that's real. And unless we're prepared to do it that way and have that conversation that way, I'm afraid we'll keep spinning our wheels, coming back, having the same conversations over and over and over again. The reason that low-income black folks were the ones hit hardest in New Orleans was not an accident. And what was stunning to me about it, and I lived there for 10 years, the only people that were shocked by what happened, for the most part, were white folks. Black folks weren't shocked that they got uprooted. They weren't shocked that they got left behind and forgotten. That was the history of that community, right? Urban renewal did that. Interstate highway construction right through the Treme, the oldest free black neighborhood in this country, did that. And so it was just same thing, different day. A little bit more extreme, and the cameras were on, and they made movies about it. But it was the same stuff that had always been happening. So we have to go back to that systemic understanding, which is something I think the movement historically knew, but most of our leaders have sometimes forgotten.
Wow. So we're going to have a real conversation today, aren't we? I think I'm ready.
As you can tell from Clarence's reaction, that was 5 years ago. What Tim Wise said in that 3.5 minutes could be one for me sitting in that audience was uncomfortable to hear. It was overwhelming. Obviously, as you could see, it caught Clarence by surprise. He's usually never lost for words. But the reason why I played even 5 years later in the space that I have with you is to really to share the work of understanding what Tim Wise just said. I found myself wondering, like, how do I help city leaders understand what Tim Wise just said in 3.5 minutes? What's the work that you as city leaders need to be understanding as you think about your leadership in this space? And so while this is not a kind of what we consider more of our robust training, this is me kind of a preview to a training. It's called an introduction intentionally. But we do want to introduce some of that term, some of the terminology, some of the language, because it's really important to have a starting point, to lay a foundation that goes beyond just understanding what racial equity is, which is what I did in the first part of normalizing, but want to name some other key terminology, some shared spaces for how that we could build on as we continue to think about, as leaders, the role that you play in your cities and your towns and villages. And so I want to start by naming very clearly the differences between equality and equity. And it's really important, particularly in the work we do with city leaders, that you're not using these words interchangeably, and hopefully you walk away and this diagram can help you, if you haven't seen it before, understand that there is clear differences between equality and equity. And so in this diagram, it's intended to be very simplified. It's 3 people trying to watch a game from behind the fence, and equality is giving them the same thing, right? And there's assumptions that the people are starting from the same place, right? And you're giving them the kind of the same thing to be able to watch the game from behind the fence. The equity is asking the questions: what do they need? What do they need to be able to watch the game from behind the fence? The person on the left doesn't need anything, can watch the game from behind the fence just fine. The person in the middle needs 2 boxes, and the person on the right needs a ramp. And so equity is recognizing, asking the right question about what does a person need as you're setting clear goals, right? And so my hope here is that if you haven't seen this diagram before, at least you walk with like, yeah, I remember that diagram helps you realize equity, equality, 2 very different words, right? Giving people the same thing, and equity is of giving people what they need, justice and fairness, right? But I also really want to make sure that you recognize that as we start to do more equity work within your city, using this same kind of diagram, it can become, when you start to do equity, it's much more complicated. There are lots of other questions and things you need to be thinking about, that you need to be asking yourself. There could be, if the goals are for them to watch the game from behind the fence, there are questions about, do they have the same starting points? Or is there something wrong with the fence that we've designed to help them be able to watch the game from behind the fence? And if you're really starting to do equity work, then you start asking, well, do we have the right goals? Why is it that they're behind the fence? How come they're not in the stands watching the game? Or how come they're not playing in the game? Or how come they don't own the team, right? There are lots of equity questions you start to ask as you really are digging in and realizing the layers to equity, right? But we want you to at least walk away recognizing the differences between equality and equity, and also that the work of equity is layered, right, in the work we do. And then the second terminology we want to make sure we're bringing into this space as we're laying a foundation is talking about bias. Particularly as we talk about bias in the context of racial equity, right? As we understand bias, it's a term that we all have heard and may have used, and just want to define what it is. Bias is an evaluation and an association of one group and its members relative to another, right? We all make these evaluations and associations, right? And so you may have heard people say, oh, we all have bias, right? We all make the evaluation. Sometimes we do it very explicitly, we're very conscious of it. Sometimes we do it very implicitly. It's an inescapable reality of who we are as humans, right? And so as we talk about bias, the reason why it's so important to talk about bias and understand bias in the context of advancing a racial equity agenda is how we choose to use our bias, how it influences us, influences our actions, particularly when those actions can be discriminatory or lead or create negative outcomes. And that's where it's important to make sure you're normalizing the understanding of particularly implicit bias as we talk about the work that centers racial equity within your city. And so it's within the implicit bias space that the research spends a lot of time talking about the unconscious mind, how our brains work, and how our brains quickly sort things into schemas and organizes things into frames to help us understand the world and navigate through the world. And it's within that space that the brain quickly sorts things into categories and creates associations, it fills in the gaps really quickly, right? And so mention one of the examples I've mentioned as my personal acknowledgement of how my brain works, right, is when I was in New Orleans the last time, and when we were traveling and on planes, and had alligator for the first time, and I just said, man, this thing tastes just like chicken, right? I put it right into my chicken category, right? And all of our brains do some kind of those gymnastics all the time, right? And so it's within that, while again, this is not a training, I do want to acknowledge some of that bias in how our brains work. So I brought this short video to see how well you do, and I'm gonna play. You gotta pay close attention because it's there's a lot of moving things happening. So this count how many passes the white team makes.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
So at this point, if you counted the number of passes. If this was an interactive exercise, I'm hoping most of you would have gotten somewhere in the 13 range. Is that about right? Well, let's see.
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Yeah, so what just happened there, right? And what, you might have gotten to 13, right? But the whole point of the video was to also acknowledge that your brain is taking in other things that are happening all around you, things that you're not even being conscious about. And here comes this bear, was there before, you didn't see it. But, and so it's acknowledging that in this unconscious space, that there are other things that are happening all around us, and that we have to be very mindful of that in terms of how our brain works, right? Assuming you haven't seen the video, most of us would not have seen the bear. Now, I want to also acknowledge, for someone who grew up in the 80s and remember when the moonwalk was introduced by Michael Jackson, that is not what I would consider moonwalking. So I just want to at least name that to make sure we are acknowledging that that was something other than moonwalking. And hopefully you don't get distracted by that. You got the larger point, right? And so I started there, right, in a way of trying to name something very light. But the reason why we talk about bias is to also understand bias in terms of how we've been exposed, all of us to a person, as we talk about race. Each of us have been exposed to race in some way, whether it's where we grew up, whether it's through our faith, whether it's through our educational institutions or other social or civic institutions, through our fraternities and sororities, et cetera, or even through all the different exposures we've had in media and how the different things that we've taken in to understand race. And most of the time, the way we're taking in and understanding race happens in the unconscious space, right? And the reason why that's important to name as we're talking about the work that needs to happen in centering racial equity in our cities is it's in that space of when we start to realize all of the ways that we've been exposed to understand race and how we start to then identify certain groups automatically and unconsciously with certain characteristics, right? And that is where we are in this country as we are watching what is unfolding right now in front of our eyes, right? It's what we know from the research already, that there is a strong implicit association that exists between Blacks and criminal activity. In the implicit space, we know it's there. And so the work is not acknowledging that it's not there. It's like, what do we need to do in really understanding how do we unpack that and how that's playing itself out? And so it's within that space I want to bring in this short clip that it would be wonderful to have a discussion as we go deeper with you, but wanted to at least bring it in naming it. What I appreciate about that short clip, what's called The Look, put out by Procter & Gamble, it creates an opportunity to have a discussion about what is the look, and how is that showing up? And particularly as we start to understand and want to be intentional about understanding our bias as we talk about racial equity. And I think what's also really important is to realize that to be able to really understand bias is to really understand the different layers of bias within the context of the work that needs to happen within local government, right, or within organizations, right. And this diagram, again, we would spend a lot more time on this with you with a deeper training, but wanting to at least lay it out and acknowledge that the different layers of bias. So we talked a lot about implicit bias and then acknowledge very little of the explicit. Explicit are the places where it's easier to kind of identify where the explicit is showing up, right? And so we did this exercise. This was an exercise that was completed by a local police department, and they tried to start to think about where this was showing up for them or where it could show up for them in their police department. And so looking at individual implicit bias, they were looking at those unconscious attitudes and beliefs where police officers calling for backup more often when stopping a person of color. You can obviously say that there's something could be very unconscious about that, implicit. There could be obviously examples of that being very explicit where that's happening. So it could be both, but that was an example of where it could be in the implicit space. The individual explicit is a police officer calling someone an ethnic slur when arresting them. So those are things that we are much more conscious of. We can catch it when we hear it, we see it, we know it when we smell it, right? It's all those things that are very more obvious to us. And that's the same in the institutional, at the organizational, agency levels, departments within our cities. Policies at the institutional explicit level would be policies that explicitly discriminate against the group, right? And in this case, the example they gave, a police department refusing to hire people of color. And so we know that we now have laws, right, in our country where those are illegal actions. 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law. There's legal recourse that people can be taken if an agency, if an organization is doing institutionally explicit things for the most part. It's really in the institutional implicit space where there's so much more work to be done and really understanding how this plays out within our government, within our policies, where these are policies that negatively impact one group unintentionally. And the example they gave here is the police department focusing in on street level drug arrests, right? And in that case, there was unpacking to kind of like, how is that institutional implicit, right? And so we could have a conversation about, well, if the city has a war on drugs, reducing drugs strategy, and are then choosing to, as part of that strategy, to focus on street level drug arrests, why would that have an unintentional impact to one group? Well, if you unpack that, and are starting to kind of begin using a tool and beginning to understand kind of where an institutional implicit exists, lots of good questions you can ask, right? You can ask, well, who uses, if you think about drug use, who uses drugs more, white people or people of color, right? If I was going to ask you that, there might be what we know nationally. I'm not sure in California. What we know nationally is that it's about the same. White people and people of color use drugs about the same. And when we look at who distributes drugs more, white people or people of color, what we find from the research nationally is it's almost about 50%, but it leans more white people that distribute drugs more than people of color. But then you ask about as you think about where drug use or distributions happen in white communities, predominantly white communities versus predominantly people of Black, Indigenous, or people of color. And then there are lots of other questions that you learn in that space. What we know is whites tend to distribute and use drugs in more private social settings. And we also know that there's strong evidence of more public settings where people of Black, Indigenous, people of color may be distributing or using drugs. So if you have a strategy that is saying street level drug arrests, and there's nothing in that policy that says you desire to disproportionately arrest people of color more, that the outcome of that would lead to a disproportionate number of people of color that would be arrested, right? And so hoping, just walking that through, again, this is like a crash course. I'm running it through really quickly, but wanting to at least name the work, right? In terms of understanding, as you're committed to doing this work, the reason why we spend time normalizing the bias is that it's the work of not suppressing it, not saying that we don't have bias, that it's what do we need to do to be more accountable? What do we need to do to be to take action? And that's what we want to make sure you're naming as you're normalizing why we need to do the work and what does that work look like. And so the last part of the normalizing, you know, I've named a lot of things in the normalizing space, but have not named at all racism yet, right? What is racism, right? We hear, as we talk about racism, people tend to think about racism as these individual acts of behaviors, like Dylan Roof, as you heard from the Tim Wise video, or Charlottesville 3 years ago, right? Individual acts of racism. And most people are sensitive, and that's where what we have found, where people spend a lot more time trying to understand, or that's where more anxiety comes as we think about individual racism. But as city leaders, the work of city leaders is going beyond just the individual racism. It's understanding institutional, structural racism, systemic racism, right? And I want to at least name that as we continue to build and do this work together, right? As we talk about institutional racism, it's looking at one institution in government, let's say looking at the education system within government. It's saying that they're in that institution, there are policies, practices, procedures that have worked better for white people than people of color, for Black, Indigenous, people of color. Sometimes, many times intentionally in our history, but oftentimes unintentionally or inadvertently as we look at our policies today. And that is looking at just one institution. Structural racism is saying it didn't just happen in one institution. It has happened in all of our institutions. That there are policies, practices, procedures that have benefited white people over people of color. Right, and that's the acknowledgement that as we look across how government was designed, it was designed and it's created a system of power and oppression that has created race and racial hierarchy to the advantage of white people and the disadvantage of Black, Indigenous, people of color. That is what, when they talk about that whole system, that is the diagram off to the right is acknowledging racism is all, systemic racism is the connections to all our understanding of individual, institutional, and structural racism. Systemic is the connectedness to all of it, right? And so I'm wanting to at least name that, right? Because we've heard the terms. It's helpful to kind of at least hear kind of what we mean as we say these terms, but also not just naming the terms, but also wanting to bring that in a way that we're starting to think about what does that mean for me as leaders in this space. And so again, we would love to go deeper here, but I want to at least name it and play a shorter video where we, if we had with more time, we'll have a chance to hopefully find ways of unpacking more of some of the content that's in this longer documentary that was put out by PBS, called Race, the Power of Illusion. This is a 3-part series. This short video that I'm going to play for you comes from part 3 of that 3-part series, and it's each of the documentaries are about 50 minutes each. I'm just going to play a shorter version of that to give you a sense and bring into the room hopefully a better understanding of the definition that I was just.
It was a time when hundreds of thousands of GIs came home ready to start families, but had no place to live.
In the 1930s, the federal government created the Federal Housing Administration, whose job it was to provide loans or the backing for loans to average Americans so they could purchase a home.
Federal programs and banks sank millions into the home construction industry. Their message to veterans: you can afford a new home. Buy a new home now. Tax dollars helped make the single-family home a mass-produced consumer item. The American dream had a new name: suburbia.
We came to Levittown and we found the model house, and we walked in and we looked around, and of course in the eyes of a young man who was raised in the ghetto, so to speak. It was an interesting experience, an interesting lifestyle. Seeing all the new modern conveniences, very fascinating.
Eugene Burnett came home with almost 1 million other black GIs. They had fought for the country in segregated ranks. They returned hoping for equality and the American dream. For many, that dream was a new home for little money down and some of the easiest credit terms in history.
I went up to the salesman. We're interested in your home. We're interested in buying one. And what is the procedure? Is there an application to be filled out? So forth. So he looked at me, looked around, and he said to me, he says, listen, it's not me, but the owners of this development have not as yet decided to sell these homes to Negroes.
The FHA underwriters warned that the presence of even 1 or 2 non-white families could undermine real estate values in the new suburbs. These government guidelines were widely adopted by private industry. Race had long played a role in local real estate practices. Starting in the 1930s, government officials institutionalized a national appraisal system where race was as much a factor in real estate assessment as the condition of the property. Using this scheme, federal investigators evaluated 239 cities across the country for financial risk.
So that those communities that were all white, suburban, and far away from minority areas, they received the highest rating, and that was the color green. Those communities that were all minority or in the process of changing, they got the lowest rating, and the color red. They were redlined. As a consequence, most of the mortgages went to suburbanizing America, and it suburbanized it racially.
As homes in white communities appreciated in value, the net worth of these white families grew. For most non-white families who stayed in urban neighborhoods, the housing market open to them in the 50s and 60s was largely a rental market. You don't gain equity by paying rent.
Where one's family lives in America is not just a matter of taste and preference. You have the issue of housing and wealth. The majority of Americans hold most of their wealth in the form of home equity. So that's their nest egg. That's how they can finance the education of their offspring. That's how they can sort of save up for retirement. It's their savings bank, right? They're living in their savings bank.
My family, like a lot of families, was in Detroit struggling to buy a house. You had a dual housing market, one white, one black. A housing market with one with a lot of demand, another housing market with very little demand. My father lives in the house that I grew up in. The house today, 5-bedroom house, is worth about $20,000. That same house bought in the suburbs would be worth today about $320,000. So whites moving to the suburb were being subsidized in the accumulation of wealth, while blacks were being divested.
And these were public policy decisions in which, on one hand, people were given access to property, given title, and subsequently wealth, and on another hand, where people were not given access to property, did not generate wealth, and did not generate the kind of opportunity for the next generation.
I hope that that short clip helps at least bring to life more of the definitions as we talk about institutional and structural racism. There's a lot more we could do in really unpacking that. And while this short clip showed understanding of redlining, we could have shown a video around our transportation policies that could also reinforce the same points about decisions that were made around our criminal justice system, around our education, around our food systems, right? There's so many different aspects to this narrative in the space of normalizing that's so important. And as you are doing that normalizing, what's also important to recognize in work that we do with city leaders is that understanding what normalizing is, I mean, understanding what redlining, most people have heard of redlining, right? And most city leaders have heard of redlining. If you think about folks within government, within your community, many folks, as they start to really understand redlining, there are aspects of not realizing that government played a role in redlining, right? The layers of government played a role in partnership with the private sector. And even as for those that might have a nuanced understanding of redlining, just spending time showing a clip like that brings other new insights as you start to really think about the implications of redlining. And so one of the contracts we have with the city of Denver, one aspect of the work that we do is really understanding the deeper implications of redlining, right? And this was looking at their redlining maps in the 1940s, over 80 years ago, and looking at where those neighborhoods were, and then looking at kind of their current population or close to their current population, and the darker areas being where there are a larger percentage of Black, Indigenous, people of color were, and realizing how closely overlapped those neighborhoods are today from 80 years ago. As you heard from Tim Wise in his video, that we acted at people ended up where they ended up by accident. It wasn't by accident, intentional policies that created. And then we think about policies on top of those policies as we've made other decisions around zoning and land use and all the other implications that continue to reinforce a policy that was created to benefit white people over people of color, right? And to be able to understand that space of normalizing is so important, right? And the reason why we wanted to take the time to be able to do that is that's so super important before we start talking about how you start operationalizing and organizing. And I just also want to acknowledge there's a lot more normalizing to do, but feel like this is a good start, kind of a good summary at a very high level to understand normalizing. And I just also want to, with the time I have, at least name the other two. So in realizing, hopefully you walked away realizing there's more commitment that you're making to try to do more normalizing and thinking about how to think about a normalizing strategy within your city, with partnership with your community. And so we look forward to those that are interested in wanting to do more normalizing. But also, how do you then start to think about operationalizing as a government? Now that you know why change is needed, what are some proposed solutions that you want to take that is moving beyond intent, the intent to be fair, but getting to the impact of how are we measuring what's fair and what's just? And so we have, one of the things that we offer in the work that we do with cities is really how to start using a racial equity tool. How do you use that in how you think about your process, but also as kind of your products that really drive your decision making, right? Which is how do you design that across your city and across each of your agencies? And so I'm not going to walk through the full tool, but I wanted to share with you, and this is a space where we could go deeper, right? Understanding that in using the tool, there's got to be a commitment, if you're going to be committed to racial equity, to centering the voices of your community. How do you center the voices, particularly of your Black, Indigenous, and people of color? Like, what's the work as part of your process of how that gets centered as you start thinking about, do you have the right results? Is the right result that we should be helping people watch the game from behind the fence? If you remember from that diagram earlier, like, do we have the right results? And centering the voices of the community help you realize, no, that's the wrong result. You need to be thinking differently about the kinds of results you need to be setting, right? And not you figuring that out on your own. As you then start looking at your data and understanding the data and using the community to understand data that you may not just readily have available. And then as you start thinking about your strategies and how do you implement it, and how do you think about communications and accountability? And so I want you to at least know that as you're using the tool, there's so many different aspects of how to use the tool around a range of issues, from looking at your contracting policies and procedures to looking at your complaint-based systems that you have. 911, for instance, is like a complaint-based system. how do you look at your fines and fees, to looking at your zoning and permitting, or even public and recreational spaces. So just about every city, there are aspects of how you begin to use a racial equity tool that's helping you understand who's been benefiting and burdening by some of those policies, those practices and procedures that you have in place. And so I wanted to name that and acknowledge that that's where another component of the work needs to happen. And then the other place I want to make sure I acknowledge is that how do you start thinking about getting organized? Or if you're walking away and saying, I want to get started right now, I want to lead in this space, I want to think more about, if you're leading already, thinking about more that I want to do that you could be leading, I want to encourage you to access some of our tools. And one of the tools that we created a couple of years ago was really to respond to city leaders that saying, how do I get started? How do other cities get started in doing this work? And so this Advancing Racial Equity in Your City kind of walks through 6 steps of what it takes to kind of get started right now. And giving examples of how cities are leading, of different sizes, cities, towns, and villages are leading in this space. And we've also then highlighted a range of different profiles. So you'll get a sense of, across the country, of cities that are, how cities are advancing racial equity. And I want to be very clear as we're highlighting these cities, as I said earlier, there's not one city that has figured it out, but what it does give you, what we have found in getting organized, it starts to give you a sense of kind of the different ways that cities are getting organized within their city, from the structures that they're creating, kind of their core teams, their interdepartmental teams, to how they're thinking about the work that needs to happen, from the accountability agreements to departmental agreements to performance reviews to how they're using their racial equity tools. So it begins to give you a sense of the different ways that cities are getting organized, that helps you as we start working with you as your cities in terms of how do you modify this for what can work for you in your city, in your town, and in your village. And that's really important, particularly as you start to get organized, to be thinking about the different kinds of groups that are important to organize around. And I really talk about those different groups in 4 different categories. The first group that I talk about in doing this work is thinking about those that are your advocates. People, and that might be you on this call. You might consider yourself an advocate for advancing racial equity, but there's that group that's out there that could be on council, that could be within your city, that could be in the community. And that's one group that is really to get organized around that group. A second group are the folks that are your followers, the folks that they'll show up. They might put the sign in the yard, but they're not going to get on stage, or they're not going to use a platform or speak out about it. But they're followers. They may be active followers. They'll show up for everything. They may be passive followers. But that's another group. So how do you get organized around that group? Your third group is those that are skeptical. Those that always got questions. They could be skeptical, like they're negative skeptical. They could be skeptical positive, but they're just skeptical. And what's the work that you need to do to organize around those that are skeptical on your council, within your city, within the community? And then the last group are those that are resistors. Those that could be actively resisting your efforts to advance racial equity. And what's the work that you need to do to organize around that group? And as you think about the organizing, there's strategies for each. For your advocates, what's the work to kind of help them elevate their voices? Maybe you have a diverse range of voices that are advocates within your city, within city council, within your community. Like, what's the strategy to organize that group? And for those that are followers, is there a strategy to get maybe some of those followers to become advocates? And what's the work that you can do to start organizing around that group? For those that are skeptical, and we find in this work, there are a lot of folks that have questions and skeptics about why are we doing this? And so what's the work, maybe help them, maybe they're open to becoming a follower and become active followers. And so what's the organizing around your skeptics? And for your resistors, organizing around resistors that are actively resisting, how do you get them to resist less? And recognize that this work will always have some aspects of resistors. But even in doing the work and organizing, and we do this in our trainings, is how do you learn how to talk about race even to folks that are resisting? And as you start to talk about race, how do you acknowledge a person's humanity in that space, that even they may not be supporters or followers, they might be willing to be less resistant because you're acknowledging their humanity, right? And that's, again, a space that we can go a lot more deeper in, but so important to name as you're starting to think about how to get organized. And so I wanted to end there because as you start to think about the strategies, there could be different ways of talking to your colleagues, talking to the community about why you're doing racial equity. For some, talking about racial equity could be the moral thing to do. right? It's the right thing we need to be doing. But it's also, thinking about those different groups, you could be talking about racial equity as good governance, because it is good governance, right? We know for those that are doing racial equity, it's about how do we help our city become more prosperous and healthier or safer or more accountable. And that is a really important thing to also keep in mind as you're organizing. And so one of those resources that I encourage you to also check out is the nationalequityatlas.org. This I put in just for the region within one of the California regions, but you can do multiple regions across California. They put in the Los Angeles, Long Beach, Santa Ana region. And then when you pull up, and our friends at PolicyLink were the ones that helped create that resource, nationalequityatlas.org. This one, there's a number of data points within it. And I pulled out one of the data points that really helps make the business case for racial equity, right? Again, thinking about your audiences, that might be a way to organize around one of those groups. And then looking at just that region, pulling from data from 2015, the economy would be over $500 billion larger if there were no racial gaps in income. And so that's a business case strategy. Like, we want our economy to be much larger. How do we address the racial gaps in income within this region? And how can we organize those that are willing to really help us see the value of doing that? That's not the moral thing to do, right? That's good governance, right? And so wanted to name that in our space of organizing and end where I started. I started with a quote from the late Dr. Maya Angelou. Want to end with the quote from Angela Davis, a California girl, I believe. I think she's in California. I'm no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I'm changing the things I cannot accept. And that's our hope as you're committed to really trying to figure out how you lead in this space, that you're committed to changing the things that we no longer can accept. I really appreciate your time. I'm share my contact information, and with the time that we have left, want to see if we can create the space for any questions.
Leon, thank you so much for that informative presentation. I learned something new every time I listen to you. And the next time I see this presentation or the video on the passes, I'm really going to look for the bear. I continue to miss him, even though I've seen it before. Just a reminder to write a question, select the Q&A button at the bottom of your toolbar. We already have a number of questions, and I want to give the opportunity to ask the first question to our president, Mayor Dunbar.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. Leon, again, it's such important information that you're sharing with us to make us better city leaders. Thank you so much for your time and all the experience you've put into this. I'm sure much past the 5 years in your role as director of REAL. The question I have is, do you see the attitude across the country truly shifting toward real and sustainable change, toward equity, toward justice? Is this, as Mr. Wise referenced, retail racism? Is that we're just seeing it on the internet, on the news, or is this true and real change, in your opinion?
It's a great question, Mayor. And on any given day, I could have to acknowledge that I might feel one way about the answer to that question, right? As I think about obviously what we've been seeing in the last last week with Jacob Blake, to what we saw the last 3 months with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and so many others. And so I do feel like what brings me back to hope is the work that we've been able to do with so many city leaders across the country. And the number of voices in the last 5 years that I don't think I ever would have thunk we would be here. And the diverse voices from smaller cities and towns like Mayor Jake Spano in St. Louis Park, Minnesota, white mayor who is in a city that's predominantly white, 85% white city. And for the last 4 years, he has been leading efforts on racial equity within his city, across the state, and as a powerful voice as a leader, speaking in a very compelling way about the change that he's taking within his small town and village, why it's important for us to be able to do this in our small town, to even electeds in larger cities like Mayor Hancock in Denver, right, and all the work that he's doing. So I believe that there's a good foundation that's there. I believe we have a lot more people standing on the rug, right? So it's going to be hard to be able to pull the rug from underneath it. but at the same time know that there's so much more work to do, and there's so many questions and answers that we all are still trying to figure out about what does really meaningful change look like. So we are not finding ourselves having the same conversation 5, 10, 50 years from now. That I think on any given day, right, as we're starting to see another example of racism play itself out, can be discouraging, but we got to find our way back to all those people that are standing on that rug to be committed to continuing to figure it out together. And I think it's keeping that balance as you do the work.
Thanks, Leon, for that response. Next question, and I'm going to try to get through as many as we have time for. Of the cities that you have referenced, many of them are larger cities. Are there examples of cities in the smaller range, 20,000 to 25K, and medium-sized cities up to 50,000 that you've been working with that you could share as examples? And also, do you have cities who have partnered with other cities for services like police and fire? We may have to answer that one offline, but to the first question, who are you working with in different sizes of cities?
Yeah, so the short answer is yes, we definitely are working with a range of cities, towns, and villages. I've tried to intentionally use that language because we are working in a number of towns, a lot of smaller towns. We have some contractual work doing right now in a town in Massachusetts, Arlington, Massachusetts. I mentioned St. Louis Park, Minnesota. Off the top of my head, I'm probably not good at remembering all of the conversations that we're having, that we are fielding. But what I have found is that the diversity of those that are interested, whether it's leaders from smaller cities, leaders from cities that are predominantly white, leaders from cities that have a very mixed population. There's so many, as I mentioned in that last response, so many different people standing on the rug right now. And I think the work is, it looks very different. So for instance, in Arlington, they're a much smaller town. We've done a series of trainings with them. They are also, their diversity is very different because they have a very large Asian Pacific Islander population, right? And so how do we understand race within an API culture, and how are we centering their voices as well in the space? So there's not a one size fits all. There's not a one approach. But what we are finding is that there are definitely a diversity of voices. And actually some of the profiles that we have on our website, I think there are two or three from smaller cities. St. Louis Park is highlighted, Village of Park Forest, and the work that Mayor John Ostenberg has been doing there. We've worked with him. So there's some smaller cities that you can also learn from, and we can, as we do this work, that will balance some of the more mid-sized, larger city work that is happening.
Leon, have you had any experience with this question of greater housing density and its connection to issues of racial equity?
In what aspects?
Well, it could be resistance to greater housing density.
Oh yeah, zoning. Yeah, no, that yes is the short answer to the question. I mean, it's there a range of not in my backyard dynamics that that come to the forefront in doing this work, particularly as we start to normalize the conversations with different cities. There's a scenario that we pulled that actually captured an actual city council dialogue as they were talking about zoning and housing density, that really named some of we didn't talk about this in this presentation, coded language, coded words about not those people, and how you really need to, what's the work you need to do as city leaders to call that out, to name it. How are you using data as well to really drive disaggregated data to be able to drive and frame the conversation? But also, again, at a very high level, just wanting to talk about how are you being intentional about centering voices, particularly within your community of your Black, Indigenous, and people of color, as you're having those conversations. So it's not a conversation that doesn't include their voices, right? And how there could be an imbalance to the dialogue. So housing is one of those really critical issues that continually, consistently shows up in the racial equity work.
Thank you. How do we positively change implicit racism in the workplace while in leadership or in subordinate positions? In other words, how do you best move the conversation in a healthy direction without it negatively impacting you or others?
Yeah, it's a great question. That's I'm going to do my best to try to keep this answer short. I mean, I think the good news is that there are good models of how you can do work within an organization to really address some of the implicit bias and some of that shows up at the individual level. From trainings, the commitment to trainings that you need to have as an organization, that everyone goes through these trainings. To also how you think much more about how you embed it in your practices in terms of one of the tools that we've created that we hopefully will have a chance to share more with you is kind of a root cause analysis guide that also has as a part of it an equity glossary, and what's the work that needs to happen to help people understand how do you get to the root causes of what it is that we need to be talking about, and getting people understanding racial equity in a way to be able to use the root cause analysis guide. Let me keep the answer short. There definitely is some tools and trainings we could offer, how you create the space for changing some of your policies, practices, and procedures. I think it's the short way I would say it is many people think you have to change attitudes before behaviors. It's actually the reverse. Right? You need to be committed to how do I change behaviors, attitudes follow, right? And the way I think about that is where you as an organization about what's the behavior work that you can change by the policies you're setting, the practices you're setting, and that is kind of what you should be committed to, and not work about the individual attitudes of one or two people within that you're worried about, right? That you think is what you need to figure out first.
Leon, many of us, after hearing your presentation for the first time or for the second time and the third time, have a reaction of, wow, this is great stuff, and I want to go back to my organization, my community, and get started. Where do we begin?
Boy, there is no, I wish I could say begin here. I guess, there's never a one way to begin. One of the things that I ended quickly at the end is one of the things we put out, one of the tools we put out there, about 6 different ways we've been looking. We talk about how do you set an example? If you want to do this, what can you do as a leader to set an example? Like if you're committed, there are different ways, and you can talk about how I want to set an example that I'm committed to racial equity. There is, this might seem like a small piece, but so critical. But what space are you creating to listen to your community? Like you are acknowledging that I'm going to take this work on. We have to create the space to listen. And what does listening look like? I didn't get into listening, but listening, being very careful about when you're listening to the community, particularly trauma-informed communities, the hurt that they bring into the space, and how you need to be an effective listener in how you're allowing that hurt to be brought into the space. That might be uncomfortable. But the importance that sends the community, that you need to create the space for that to happen, while you also are committing as city leaders to making structural changes. Like you're not just creating spaces, oh, we're just listening to you, but we're committing to making some public declarations. We're committed to making some structural changes. And that sends a different kind of message, right? That you're creating the space for the healing to happen, but you're also realizing healing doesn't just happen by talking. We as government can play a role. And so what are some of those low-hanging structural changes that you can make that's not caught up in a process piece, or we need to go back and study, or we need more data, but you're acknowledging like these are some things we can do right now that we know, as we talk about institutional racism and look at our policies that have burdened, as we're hearing from our community, burdened Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So you got to be willing to do that. That foundation, I think, sends a powerful message that we haven't figured everything out, but we're making some real commitments to centering racial equity in our work.
I know that, Leon, a number of folks, and this is coming up in some of the questions, are very interested in resources to learn more. And we have some questions about getting links to some of the videos you have shown, and we'll certainly be able to make that available to those on the call today. But I'm wondering if I could have either 2 to 3 pieces of literature or toolkits or something that I could look at to enhance my understanding of areas of equity, what would you recommend? Are there books? Are there toolkits?
Yeah, we can also send some good reads, good podcasts, some good documentaries that we would encourage folks if they want to go deeper. We can do that as a follow-up as well. As a city leader, one of the two of the tools that we put out, I mentioned one already, Advancing Racial Equity. That's one tool that I would encourage city leaders to look at that give you a sense of how different cities are leading in this space. The other one that I think has a lot of good substance for you as a city leader to reflect on is our tool we put out on racial tension, responding to racial tension in your city. And it does a good job of capturing, understanding what systemic racism is, examples of not just redlining, but transportation and racial covenants and our criminal justice system, understanding it while also thinking about your values. Like, what kind of values do I want to bring into this space if I'm going to be leading? And I think that's a good foundation for you as leaders to both understand kind of what you're taking on and also how you show up for it if you're going to be committed to doing this work. And so I encourage, and that's something we can also include as another link as well in the resources that we can send out to you.
That's terrific. In the 4 minutes that we have remaining, Leon, I'm going to give you the last word on any advice you would have for those of us on the call who are interested in advancing this work in our communities.
As I think about where we are, I find myself, reflecting on, I think we all are finding ourselves reflecting on what does this all mean with all the images that we're seeing in our cities and what's happening, in other cities across this country. And I want to leave with, I think a space that just as a city leader, how important it is if you're committed to understanding, this statement, I believe we can end racial inequity. Do you believe that? I believe we can end racial inequity. And that might be hard, depending on any given day. You might feel like we can never get there, right? And it doesn't say I believe we can end racial equity in my lifetime, but I believe there's something I can do if I'm committed to doing this, to try to figure out what's my part in trying to help get to that ultimate space. And so I think about that in the context of our history, full trajectory as a country, as I think about my lifetime and things that I have seen change because of leadership, local leadership. And the examples that come to mind as I think about my background, my mom, 45, 6, 7 years ago, almost 50 years ago, could have been, she would, this happened, she was an avid smoker and could have been with talking to my doctor in the hospital, sharing a cigarette, and they were talking about my health. Right. And so I think about how that has changed in the last 45, 50 years, all the work that's happened to make sure that we have changed policy practices and also attitudes, where now we have policies where you have to be 25 feet away from the building just to send the message that you don't belong in the building. Right. And I also think within that same timeline of how my mom could have been driving me to the doctor, which she did, holding me in her hand, putting on her makeup, and smoking that same cigarette, and all of that was legal, right? And if I think about the policies that we have done, and this is local leadership, to be able to change our seatbelt policy, right? Where, the car, baby seats have to be faced one way until they weigh a certain pounds, and you got to turn it back the other way, and you have to sit in the seat until you're a certain age. All of that is policies we've changed, right? And by no means am I comparing, seatbelt policy and tobacco use to ending racial equity, but it's the work that we can do, that I believe we can do, that gets us to ending racial equity. What's that work? How do we figure out a way to get back to that hope? And I'm hoping we can always find those seeds that help us remind us of those opportunities of what leadership looks like, even as we go through some difficult times.
I speak on behalf of my board and my officers. We look forward to partnering with you and NLC on this work as we go forward. To all those who are still on the call today, know that a recording of the webinar, along with the slides, will be sent following today's event. Also, just as a reminder, Christine mentioned it earlier, today's webinar is the first in a series of resources and engagement opportunities that we look forward to making available to you. Our goal is to be a resource and an asset to you, and to help you and to support you as you lead in advancing equity in your own communities. The next opportunity you will have to do this will be at the League's virtual annual conference. I believe we'll have a slide up there with the details. October 7 through 9, 2020. It will be a virtual conference, but we'll look forward to seeing you there.